Hello everyone, I'm the 12th Women's World Chess Champion Alexandra Kostyniuk, and in this video we're gonna talk about king and pawn versus king endgames. It's the basic of the very basic, but still it can be tricky and complicated. And why is it so important to know these basics? Because in a practical game, sometimes you need to take a decision whether to go or not go to the pawn endgames. For example, in this position, it's a position from my game. I was playing white. So should I play knight d5 and exchange the knights? Or shall I refrain from exchanging the knights and try to play with the knights on the board? Since I knew the basics, since I knew that this endgame is a winning endgame, I exchanged the knights and won this game. So let's see what one should know in order to play well with a pawn or against a pawn. Let's start with a so-called rule of the square. When there is just one pawn on the board, it's quite obvious that in order to win, you need to promote this pawn into a queen or a rook. In order to save the game, the defending king should stop this pawn and make a draw if possible. Sometimes it's possible to promote a pawn without the help of the king. If the king is too far away and if the defending king is also not in front of the pawn, then the pawn is capable on its own to be promoted. It just should run as fast as it can. And in order to verify whether it's going to be in time or not in time to be promoted, we use a rule of the square. And in order to draw it very fast, you first draw a diagonal from the pawn to the edge of the board and thus make a square like this. And if the defending king is in time to get into the square and the king of the stronger side is far away, it means it's going to be a draw, or it means that this defending king will be in time to stop the pawn. If the king is not in time to get to the square, that means that the pawn will be promoted. For example, here, if it's black to move, the king gets to the square, king f4, and thus is in time to stop the pawn and make a draw. If it's white to move, the pawn goes forward, and unfortunately for the king, it cannot stop the pawn. Also, try to remember that running from behind doesn't help. The king should be in front of the pawn or run from the side of a pawn in order to stop it. Also, when we talk about the rule of the square, we should keep in mind that if the pawn is in the starting position, that means that we actually should calculate her square from the square a4 here, because it can go to a4. And in this position, if it's white to move, that means that the pawn goes to a4 and her square is like this. Thus, the king is not in time to get into the square, and we can verify that it's late and the pawn gets promoted and wins the game. If it's black to move, it means that black, by playing king f3 after a4, plays king e4 and gets in the square and saves the game. Let's move on. It's quite obvious with the rule of the square. It's about timing. You can calculate just one move after another, but sometimes this is the end of a very long calculation, and it just helps to know this rule of the square. Now we move to a very important position of Zugzwang. This is the position, and it depends whose turn it is to move. If it's white to move, it's a draw because there is just one move that saves the pawn, but unfortunately for white it's a stalemate and it's a draw. If it's black to move, then the king should leave the d8 square, thus letting white king to go to e7 and white wins. And so this fight of these two kings is all about getting this position with the right turn to move. Let's have a look at this position. We also often talk about so-called key squares. That's very useful to remember. If your pawn is still on the 5th rank, in order to win, the king of the stronger side should get to these key squares. If it gets to one of these highlighted squares, it's a winning situation for the king and the pawn. For example, here, it doesn't matter whose turn is to play. Well, if it's black to play, then the king needs to go away, and thus it will let white king to go forward, and then the pawn moves to d8 and wins. If it's white to play, then king e6, king e8, d6, king d8, d7, and we have the same position of Zugzwang that we started with, so white wins. So if you remember these key squares, it can give you an idea what to do and what not to do. One more quite interesting and important thing, that even though the key squares are quite the same for the knight's pawn, there are some stalemating tricks that one should remember, and in order to win, you need to be careful. It's a position from my blitz game, and my opponent here played king to h2. And in order to win, often with a side pawn, you need to transfer your king to h3 and then bring your pawn forward. I played king f2, king h1, and here you should pay very close attention that g3 is a stalemate, so that's why you first need to move your king to h3 and then play g3, g2, and again the same position as Zugzwang, similar to the one that we discussed. And that's how I won the game. Let's see what would happen if my opponent would play king g1. Then it should be said that g3 is a very serious mistake, and this is a trap to try to get your opponent into, because after king h1, surprisingly, king f2 leads to a stalemate, and g2, king g1, king g3 leads to a stalemate. So in order to win, black needs to play king g3, and after king h1, black needs to play king f2, and that's how the position with knight's pawn is won if your king is in time to get to these key squares before the pawn reaches the 3rd or 6th rank. Let's push the pawn a little bit down. If it's on the 4th rank, the key squares are those that I just highlighted in red. In other words, the 3 squares, one horizontal away from the pawn, and it's all what we're fighting for in this kind of situations. And it depends. If white is in time to get to these key squares, white wins. If black is in time to stop white's king, it's a draw. And that's when we talk about a position. For example, right now, white and black king oppose each other, and it depends on whose turn it is to move. If it's white turn to move, then black king has all his time to stop a white king to get to the key squares before the pawn goes forward to the 6th rank. And if it's black to move, unfortunately, it's a lost position for black, because after king c7 or king e7, the king will go forward. Let me try to show you this example. For example, if the king goes back, then white gets to d6, thus forcing the king away from the d file and bringing the pawn forward and winning the game. But in this particular position, in order to make a draw, you just need to wait and to control these squares before white pawn reaches the 6th rank. You just stay in front of the pawn. Here you go to d8, you stand with your king on the squares d7 and d8, and as soon as the white king goes to the side of the pawn, you meet him and greet him on c8. And we reach the position that we started with, the position after d7, king d8, king d6. This is a drawn position, and it's a draw. One example from practical games. That's the Grandmaster endgame. Lekwan Kliem played against Dmitry Andreikin on chess.com. There are many great tournaments online on chess.com nowadays, so we can see all kind of endgames and find all kind of endgames in these games. It's black to move, fortunately for black. And as we know, these are the key squares. So if it would be white to move, then king d2 would save the game, because white would not let black's king to get to the key squares. And since it's black to move, of course, not e4, because in that case king d2 saves the game, and we know the drill: king e4, king e1, king d3, king d1, and it's a stalemate. But in order to win, king always goes forward and prepares the red carpet for pawn. So here king e3 was played by Dmitry Andreikin, and after king d1, king f2, the red carpet is ready, and the pawn is about to become a queen. And that's why white resigned, because there is no way to stop this pawn from queening. A very nice example. That's the position of my chess.com blitz game against Sarah Hadelman-Charrier, Women's Speed Chess Championship. I was playing white, and I made a draw quite easily, just by not letting black's king to go forward before the pawn does. So I waited like this, and when the king goes to the side, I greeted the king by playing king e2, f3, king f2, then I just wait in front of the pawn, and when the king goes to the side, e3 or g3, I greet him by playing to g1 or e1, and the stalemate arises. One more thing to know, very useful thing to know, is a so-called waiting move. Again, fighting for a position. That's the endgame between Miguel Naitov and Ribley Zoltan. It's white to move. We see that the kings are in a position, and if the pawn would be on g3, it would be a draw with white to move. But luckily for white, they have this winning move, g3, thus forcing black to lose their position, to play king f6, and opening the road to the king to h5. That's how the game continued. We already talked about the knight's pawn, so there are some tricks, but it's easy for white here, because after king h8, they go to f7 and then play g6 with a check, winning the game. And in order to finish this video, I need to say a few things about side pawns. With side pawns, it's different. With side pawns, well, actually it's quite easy for the defending king. In order to make a draw, you need to get in front of the pawn. If you're in time to get in front of the pawn, it's a draw. There are no key squares, no opposition, nothing. You just stay in front of the pawns, stay in the corner, and there is nothing the stronger side can do. It's gonna be a draw. And it doesn't matter how many pawns your opponent has. It can be as many as 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 pawns. It's still a draw if you get in front of these side pawns. But in order to make a draw, sometimes you don't have time to get in front of the pawn straight away, but these key squares are the squares to remember, because if your king gets on one of those two squares before the pawn reaches the 7th rank, it's also a drawn position. That's the endgame of my chess.com game, blitz game against Anna Muzachuk. I was playing white. If it would be my turn to move, then I would win this game. For example, let's make a blunder. Let's play king d6. Then I would play king b6, thus cutting off this king from the safe squares. King d7, king b7, not letting the king go to c8 or c7, and thus winning the game. But Anna Muzachuk is a very, very strong player, and of course she knows the basics of pawn endgames, and that's why she played king to d7, getting to c8 just in time. And if I play a5, then the king is in time to get in front of the pawn. I played king to a7, but that doesn't help me, because if I play king a8 and try to secure the a8 square, it all leads to a beautiful stalemate. If I play king b6, it's very important to get to b8. And after a6, I've seen so many games of younger players who were scared of the side pawns and started running away. No, never run away. Face this pawn with courage and just block it. And it's a draw. If you get to the corner, it's a draw. And that's all. That's all you need to know when you fight against one pawn. It's quite easy. Don't be scared. Just face this pawn and try to get in front of it. It often is the key to save those positions. Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed and found these videos useful, and see you in the next one.